3 months after that fateful night, the community center buzzed with energy. What had started as one tense traffic stop had grown into something remarkable. The large meeting room was packed with faces: police officers, medical professionals, local residents, and community leaders, all gathered for the first graduation ceremony of the new Community Bridge program. At the podium, Raj stood in his scrubs, having come straight from his shift at the ER. The audience listened intently as he shared his story. Change doesn't always come from big moments, he explained, his voice carrying clearly through the room. Sometimes it starts with one person willing to admit they were wrong, and another person willing to help make things right. Officer Wilson sat in the front row, no longer just a patrol officer, but now the program's lead coordinator. The past 3 months had transformed her as much as the program itself. She'd worked tirelessly, turning her mistake into motivation for change. When I was stopped that night, Raj continued, I could have filed a complaint. I could have gotten angry. Maybe I had every right to. But Lieutenant Rodriguez showed us a different path, one where we turned confrontation into conversation and mistakes into opportunities. The program they'd developed was unlike anything the department had tried before. It wasn't just about bias training, it was about breaking down walls. Police officers spent time shadowing healthcare workers in the ER, seeing firsthand how professionals like Raj treated everyone equally. In turn, community members got to experience the challenges officers face daily. Today, we're graduating our first class of bridge builders, Raj announced, gesturing to the groups seated in the front rows. 30 officers and 30 community members who've spent the last 3 months learning to see through each other's eyes. The changes were already visible. Traffic stop complaints had dropped significantly. Officers were spending more time walking neighborhoods, getting to know residents. The emergency room reported better cooperation during crisis situations. Small changes, perhaps, but meaningful ones. Lieutenant Rodriguez stepped up to the podium next, his daughter sitting proudly in the audience. 3 months ago, I watched one of my officers make a mistake, he began. But more importantly, I watched her own that mistake and commit to doing better. That's what this program is about, not perfection, but progress. The lieutenant held up a familiar-looking photo album, the same one Raj had shown them that night. This album taught us something important. Every person we encounter has a story. Our job isn't to write that story for them based on our assumptions, but to give them the respect and dignity to tell their own story. In the audience, Mrs. Thompson, the elderly neighbor who'd watched everything unfold that night, wiped away tears. Next to her sat the young man who'd recorded the incident, now an active volunteer in the program, helping to document its success for other departments interested in implementing similar changes. Officer Wilson took her turn at the podium, her transformation evident in her confident stance. When I stopped that BMW 3 months ago, I thought I was doing my job. I was wrong. My real job started the moment I admitted that mistake and committed to change. The ceremony continued with the graduation certificates being handed out, but something more important was being exchanged: understanding, respect, and trust. Each graduate had spent time walking in someone else's shoes, seeing the world through different eyes. As the event drew to a close, Raj couldn't help but smile at the sight of officers and community members mingling freely, sharing stories and laughs. His BMW, parked outside, had become something of a symbol, not of prejudice or privilege, but of transformation and hope. Ready for the next class? Officer Wilson asked, approaching him with a stack of new applications. The program had caught the attention of neighboring districts, and requests to participate were pouring in. Always, Raj replied, thinking about how far they'd come from that tense night on a quiet street. You know what the best part is? Every person in this room now has their own story to tell, and each of those stories will create more change. As people filed out of the community center that evening, the sun setting on another day of progress, Raj realized something profound. The incident that could have been just another sad statistic had instead become a catalyst for real change. It wasn't the end of the journey, far from it. But it was proof that sometimes the worst moments can lead to the best outcomes if people are brave enough to learn from them. As the impromptu training session drew to a close, Officer Wilson knew she had one more thing to do. While her fellow officers began returning to their vehicles, she approached Raj with determination in her steps. The neighboring porch lights had started turning off one by one, but several residents remained at their windows, watching the scene's conclusion unfold. "Could we talk privately for a moment?" she asked, her voice carrying a mix of professional composure and personal regret. Raj nodded, and they stepped away from the group, moving toward his B&O. "I need to do more than just apologize," she began, pulling out her notepad. "I'm going to file a self-reported incident review first thing tomorrow morning. Not because anyone's making me, but because what happened here tonight needs to be documented properly." Raj watched as she began writing, her pen moving quickly across the paper. "What exactly are you documenting?" he asked, genuine curiosity in his voice. "Everything," she replied, looking up from her notepad. "My initial assumptions. The lack of probable cause. The way I approached your vehicle with my hand near my weapon. The backup I called without justification." She paused, making sure to meet his eyes. "All of it." Lieutenant Rodriguez observed from a distance, nodding approvingly. He was already making plans in his mind for how this incident would reshape their department's training. His phone buzzed, a text from his daughter asking why he was running late. The irony wasn't lost on him. "You know," Officer Wilson continued, her pen still moving across the paper, "we have bias training every year. We watch videos, take tests, discuss scenarios. But nothing has ever hit home like tonight." She looked around at the quiet street, the departing patrol cars, the few remaining observers in their windows. "This is real. This is our community." Raj leaned against his car, feeling the cool metal through his scrubs. "Can I share something with you?" When she nodded, he continued, "In the ER, we sometimes have patients who don't want me as their nurse. They take one look and make assumptions. But we can't let that stop us from doing our jobs, from helping people." Officer Wilson's pen stopped moving. "How do you handle that?" she asked, genuinely interested. "By being better than their assumptions," he replied simply. "Every time someone doubts me, I work harder to prove that their prejudice is their problem, not mine." "But," he added, looking meaningfully at her notepad, "it helps when people are willing to acknowledge their biases and work to change them." As they talked, a small group of neighbors had cautiously emerged from their homes, gathering at a respectful distance. Among them was Mrs. Thompson, an elderly resident who frequented the ER where Raj worked. She waved when she caught his eye, then turned to explain something to the others. Soon, understanding nods spread through the small crowd. "I'd like to request something," Officer Wilson said, closing her notepad. "Would you be willing to help us develop new training protocols? Your perspective as both a medical professional and, well, someone who's experienced profiling firsthand, it could be invaluable." Before Raj could respond, Lieutenant Rodriguez rejoined them. "That's an excellent suggestion," he said. "But first, I think we owe you something else." He turned to Officer Wilson. "Officer?" She straightened her shoulders, her voice clear and professional. "Sir, I am formally acknowledging that this stop was conducted without proper cause, influenced by personal bias, and escalated without justification. I recommend all record of this stop be expunged, and I volunteer to take additional training in bias recognition and prevention." The lieutenant nodded, then added something unexpected. "I'd like to take it a step further. Officer Wilson, I'm assigning you to develop a new community outreach program. Work with local residents, medical professionals, and community leaders. Let's turn this mistake into an opportunity for real change." The remaining neighbors had edged closer, close enough to hear the conversation. One of them, a young man with a phone still recording, spoke up. "Could regular people be part of this too? Like, could we help?" Lieutenant Rodriguez looked at his watch. It was well past midnight now, but the energy on the street didn't feel late at all. It felt like the beginning of something important. "That's exactly what we need," he replied. "Community involvement, real dialogue, actual change, not just talking about it." He turned to Raj. "Would you be willing to be part of this? Help us build something better?" The weight of the moment wasn't lost on anyone present. What had started as a biased traffic stop was transforming into something none of them had expected, a chance for genuine community transformation. Lieutenant Rodriguez knew this moment could either be just another uncomfortable traffic stop or something more meaningful. With all body cameras recording, he made a decision that would reshape his department's approach to training and community relations. "Gather round," he called to his officers, motioning them into a closer circle. The flashing lights from the patrol cars created an almost theatrical atmosphere, as if highlighting the importance of what was about to unfold. What we're about to do here isn't in any manual, but it might be the most important training you'll ever receive. The lieutenant turned to Raj, who still stood beside his BMWo, watching the scene with quiet dignity. "Sir, would you be willing to share with these officers how many times you've been stopped while driving this car?" Raj took a deep breath, considering his words carefully, including tonight, 7 times in 6 months. His voice was calm, but the impact of his words was visible on the officers' faces. "Each time, I was asked to prove it was my car. Each time, I had to explain how I could afford it." A young officer in the back raised his hand hesitantly. "But sir, if there's been a lot of car theft in the area..." His voice trailed off as Lieutenant Rodriguez shook his head. "Good point, Officer Baker. Let's explore that," the lieutenant said. "Can anyone tell me how many BMWs were reported stolen in our district in the past 6 months?" The officers looked at each other uncertainly. Finally, Officer Wilson spoke up. "2, sir. Both were recovered. Neither matched this model or color." "So 7 stops, no legitimate probable cause," Lieutenant Rodriguez summarized. "Just a gut feeling, right? Let's talk about that gut feeling. What exactly made this car suspicious tonight?" The silence that followed was heavy with understanding. Through nearby windows, neighbors who had been watching leaned closer, some still recording on their phones. This wasn't just a police matter anymore, it was becoming a community moment. "I'm a nurse," Raj spoke up, his voice steady. "Every day, I treat people regardless of their skin color, their wealth, or their background. When someone comes into my ER, they get the same level of care. Because in that moment, they're just human beings who need help." His words resonated across the gathered group. Even the most seasoned officers seemed to be processing this perspective with new understanding. "Let me show you something," Raj continued, reaching slowly into his car. He pulled out a small photo album from the glove compartment. "I keep this to remind me why I worked so hard for this car." The album contained photos of his journey: attending nursing school, graduating from his BMW certification program, working late nights in the ER, and finally, standing proudly next to his car at the dealership. Each image told part of a story that should have mattered more than a split-second judgment. Lieutenant Rodriguez seized this teaching moment. "This is what we miss when we let bias drive our decisions. We miss the story. We miss the humanity. We miss the truth." He looked at each officer in turn. "And worse, we damage the trust that our community puts in us." Officer Wilson stepped forward again. "Sir, with your permission, I'd like to say something." When the lieutenant nodded, she turned to face Raj directly. "I was wrong tonight. Not just about the car, but about everything I assumed when I first saw you. I let bias overrule my training, and that's not the kind of officer I want to be." The sincerity in her voice was unmistakable. This wasn't just a formal apology, it was a moment of genuine self-reflection and growth. Lieutenant Rodriguez nodded approvingly. "This is how change happens," he said, "not through memos or mandatory seminars, but through real conversations and honest admissions. Every person we stop is someone's son, daughter, father, mother, someone who deserves the same respect we'd want for our own families." The night air had grown cooler, but nobody seemed to notice. The impromptu training session had captured everyone's attention, creating a moment of shared understanding that transcended rank and position. "Tomorrow," the lieutenant announced, "I'm going to request that this incident be included in our department's training materials. With your permission," he looked at Raj, "we'd like to use this as a case study in how bias affects decision-making and how we can do better." The significance of this request wasn't lost on anyone present. This wasn't just about correcting one mistake, it was about preventing countless others from happening in the future. A car passed by slowly, its driver rubbernecking at the unusual scene. 6 police officers standing in a loose circle, having what appeared to be a teaching moment on a residential street at midnight. The flashing lights from the patrol cars created moving shadows that danced across their serious faces. The lesson unfolding on that quiet street would soon extend far beyond this single incident. As the officers' body cameras continued recording, none of them realized that this footage would become a cornerstone of their department's new training program, a real-world example of how bias affects policing and how it can be confronted constructively. Lieutenant Rodriguez's recognition of Raj marked a turning point in the night's events. Standing under the streetlight, the lieutenant's mind flashed back to that night in the ER. His daughter had been terrified after the accident, and this nurse had stayed well past his shift to comfort her. He remembered walking into the hospital room to find his daughter finally sleeping peacefully, her hand held by the same man who now stood surrounded by police cars. 3 months ago, Lieutenant Rodriguez began, his voice carrying across the quiet street. "I was stuck at a crime scene when I got the call every parent dreads. My daughter had been in a car accident." He turned to face his officers, who stood in rapt attention. "I couldn't leave the scene for almost an hour. Do you know what this man did?" The officers remained silent, but their body language had changed. The earlier suspicion had been replaced by curiosity and, in some cases, shame. Officer Wilson, in particular, couldn't seem to meet anyone's eyes. "He had already worked a 12-hour shift," the lieutenant continued. "But he stayed with my girl for another 2 hours, unpaid, just so she wouldn't be alone. He told her stories about learning to fix cars. He brought her warm blankets and made her laugh despite her broken arm." Raj stood quietly, remembering that night. The girl had reminded him of his own niece back home, same age, same brave spirit. Staying late hadn't even been a question in his mind. That's what nurses did, they cared for people who needed them. And tonight, Lieutenant Rodriguez's voice took on an edge. "We pulled him over because..." Why exactly? He looked pointedly at Officer Wilson. Because he was driving a nice car. Because he didn't fit someone's idea of who should be driving a BMW. The silence that followed was deafening. Even the usual night sound seemed muted, as if nature itself was listening to this impromptu lesson in prejudice and privilege. Through nearby windows, neighbors who had been watching the scene unfold leaned closer, sensing they were witnessing something significant. Officer Wilson stepped forward, her face flushed but her stance determined. "Sir, I made an assumption," she admitted, her voice steady despite her obvious discomfort. "I saw an expensive car in this neighborhood at midnight and I jumped to conclusions. I was wrong." The lieutenant nodded, but his expression remained stern. "And those conclusions were based on..." He let the question hang in the air, forcing everyone present to confront the uncomfortable truth behind this stop. "On bias, sir," Officer Wilson replied, straightening her shoulders. "Racial bias. I saw his skin color and the car, and I made assumptions I had no right to make." Her admission, though difficult, carried a note of genuine realization. Raj watched this exchange with mixed emotions. He'd experienced similar situations before, but something felt different this time. Instead of being brushed aside or dismissed, the issue was being confronted head-on, in the open, with cameras rolling. "Look at these credentials," Lieutenant Rodriguez said, holding up Raj's documents. 2 professional certifications, a career saving lives. A hobby turned into a skill that helped him afford his dream car. But none of that mattered because of a split-second judgment based on appearance. He turned to address all the officers present. "This is why we're failing our communities. This is why people don't trust us. Because too often, we see what we expect to see instead of what's actually there." The weight of his words settled over the group. Some officers shifted uncomfortably, others nodded in understanding. One young officer in the back was furiously taking notes on his notepad. "And you know what the real tragedy is?" The lieutenant continued. "This happens every day. But most people in Mr. Raj's position don't turn out to be the same nurse who helped your daughter, or your mother, or your brother. They're just citizens being unfairly targeted, and we never have to face our mistakes." The stack of documents in Officer Wilson's hands told the story she wasn't expecting. Each paper was crisp, organized, and meticulously maintained. The BMW dealership paperwork showed a clear trail of savings and payments. The maintenance records were detailed, showing regular service performed by Raj himself at his certified workshop. His hospital ID badge gleamed under the streetlight, the words "Senior Emergency Nurse" clearly visible beneath his photo. As she studied the documentation, the atmosphere began to shift. The tight grip on her flashlight loosened slightly, and her stance became less rigid. The other officers, still positioned around the car, seemed to pick up on this change. Through his side mirror, Raj could see them exchanging glances. "These are very thorough," Officer Wilson said, her voice carrying a note of surprise she couldn't quite hide. She held up his BMW certification, examining it under her flashlight. "You actually work on these cars yourself?" "Yes," Raj replied, his voice steady. "I've always loved cars, especially BMWs. I studied for the certification while working night shifts at the hospital. It took 3 years, but it was worth it." He paused, then added, "That's how I could afford this car. I do all the maintenance myself, and I saved for years." The sound of footsteps on pavement drew their attention. The figure approaching from the unmarked car moved with authority, tall, broad-shouldered, with gray at the temples. As he stepped into the light, Raj recognized the badge of a lieutenant. The nameplate read Lieutenant Rodriguez. The lieutenant took in the scene, the multiple patrol cars, their lights still flashing, the cluster of officers around a pristine BMW, the stack of documents in Officer Wilson's hands, and Raj still sitting calmly with his hands on the steering wheel. "What do we have here?" Lieutenant Rodriguez asked, his tone measured but curious. Officer Wilson handed him the documentation, and Raj watched as the lieutenant's expression changed while reviewing each page. Something flickered across his face, recognition then understanding, followed by what looked like disappointment, though not directed at Raj. "Sir," the lieutenant addressed Raj, "would you mind stepping out of the vehicle?" His tone was different from Officer Wilson's earlier commands, respectful, almost apologetic. "Keep your movements slow and deliberate, please." Raj complied, his movements careful and announced. As he stood beside his car, the full absurdity of the situation became clear. 4 police cars, 6 officers, all for a man driving his own car home from work. The neighbors' faces were now clearly visible in their windows, some holding phones, recording the scene. "Wait a minute," Lieutenant Rodriguez said suddenly, studying Raj's hospital ID more closely. "Were you working in the ER 3 months ago? Night shift?" When Raj nodded, the lieutenant's face transformed with recognition. "You were the nurse who treated my daughter after her accident. The one who sat with her until I could get there." The revelation landed like a stone in still water, sending ripples through the gathered officers. Officer Wilson's face flushed red, visible even in the dim street lighting. The other officers shifted uncomfortably, suddenly very interested in their shoes or the nearby shrubbery. "I remember her," Raj said quietly. "She was scared, but brave. Broke her arm in 2 places but didn't cry once." He remembered every detail of that night, the girl's brave face, her worry about her father being contacted, the way she'd finally fallen asleep holding his hand while waiting for her dad to arrive from his shift. Lieutenant Rodriguez's expression hardened, but not at Raj. He turned to face his officers, his back straightening. "Everyone, turn on your body cameras," he commanded. "All of them, right now." The sound of multiple cameras beeping to life filled the night air. What happened next would go beyond just resolving a misunderstanding. It would become a turning point, a moment when one officer's prejudice transformed into an opportunity for real change. As Lieutenant Rodriguez prepared to address his team, none of them realized they were about to become part of a story that would be shared in police academies across the state. The lieutenant took a deep breath, looking at each officer in turn. "I want every one of you to pay attention to what's happening here tonight," he began, "because what we're about to discuss is going to change how we do our jobs. And it starts with asking ourselves some very uncomfortable questions about why we're all standing here right now." The street had grown quiet, the only sound the idle of police engines and the soft chirp of crickets in nearby gardens. Even the neighbors watching from their windows seemed to sense the gravity of the moment. Something important was about to happen, something that would reach far beyond this single traffic stop on a quiet suburban street. The officer's flashlight beam remained fixed on Raj's face as they approached the driver's side window. He could now see it was a female officer, probably in her early 30s, with her hair pulled back tightly beneath her cap. Her name badge read Officer Wilson, and despite her professional demeanor, there was an edge of suspicion in her stance that made Raj increasingly uneasy. "Roll down your window, please," she instructed, her voice carrying that authoritative tone that all police officers seemed to master. Raj complied immediately, the soft whir of the electric window breaking the tense silence of the night. The cool night air rushed in, carrying with it the faint scent of jasmine from the nearby gardens. "Do you know why I pulled you over tonight?" Officer Wilson asked, her flashlight now scanning the car's interior. Rage noticed how she lingered on the leather seats, the modern dashboard, the spotless condition of everything inside. He'd spent countless hours maintaining this car, treating it with the same meticulous care he gave to his patients. "No, ma'am, I don't," Reg replied calmly, his voice steady despite the growing knot in his stomach. "Was I speeding?" He kept his hands visible on the steering wheel, knowing from years of ER experience how quickly situations could escalate if people made sudden movements. The question hung in the air unanswered as Officer Wilson's radio crackled with activity. 2 more officers had positioned themselves on the passenger side of the car, their shadows visible in his peripheral vision. The situation was beginning to feel increasingly surreal. 3 police cars and multiple officers for what should have been a routine traffic stop. "This is a nice car," Officer Wilson said, her tone shifting from professional to skeptical. "Really nice. How long have you owned it?" The implication in her voice was clear, and Raj felt a familiar weight settle in his chest, one he'd hoped he wouldn't have to feel again, not in 2024. "I bought it 6 months ago," he replied, maintaining his composure. "I can show you all the documentation." He noticed how Officer Wilson's hand hadn't left her holster since she approached the car. Behind him, red and blue lights continued to paint the street in alternating colors, drawing curious faces to nearby windows. "6 months, huh?" she responded, the doubt in her voice unmistakable. "And what do you do for a living that lets you afford a BMW like this?" The question stung, but Rage had learned long ago that in situations like these, emotion was his enemy. Stay calm, stay professional, stay alive. The mantra he'd learned from his father echoed in his mind. "I'm an emergency room nurse at Metropolitan General," he answered, "and I'm also a certified BMW technician. I can show you my credentials for both." He watched as surprise flickered across Officer Wilson's face, quickly replaced by what looked like embarrassment, though she tried to hide it. The radio at her shoulder crackled again. Through his side mirror, Raj could see more movement as another police car pulled up. This one was different, unmarked, with tinted windows. A senior officer, he guessed, probably called in to handle what was quickly becoming a situation. "I'm going to need to see your license, registration, and proof of insurance," Officer Wilson said, her voice now carrying a hint of uncertainty. "And those credentials you mentioned." The way she said it suggested she didn't quite believe they existed. Raj took a slow, deep breath. Years of working in emergency medicine had taught him the value of staying calm under pressure. "Of course," he replied. "My documents are in the glove compartment, and my hospital ID is in my wallet. I'm going to reach for them now, if that's okay." He narrated each movement before making it, hyper-aware of the officers watching his every move. The leather of his wallet felt oddly cold in his hands as he carefully extracted his ID. The registration and insurance papers were exactly where they should be, neatly organized in the glove compartment along with his BMW certification. As he gathered the documents, Raj caught sight of his reflection in the rearview mirror. The man looking back at him was tired but dignified, determined not to let this situation rob him of his self-respect. He'd worked too hard, come too far, to let one biased assumption define this moment. What happened next would change not just his night, but the entire trajectory of police training in their district. As he handed over his documentation, none of them knew they were about to become part of a story that would challenge assumptions, change policies, and remind everyone that sometimes the most powerful lessons come from the most uncomfortable moments. The gentle hum of the BMW's engine was the only sound accompanying Raj on his drive home that night. The digital clock on his dashboard read 11:45 p.m., and the streets were nearly empty. After another exhausting 12-hour shift at Metropolitan General's emergency room, all he wanted was to get home, take a hot shower, and catch a few hours of sleep before his next shift. The night air was crisp, and streetlights cast long shadows across the road. Raj couldn't help but smile as he guided his car around a corner. This 2019 BMW 3 Series represented years of hard work and dedication. He'd spent countless hours studying to become both an ER nurse and a certified BMW technician, picking up extra shifts and saving every penny he could. The car wasn't just transportation, it was a symbol of everything he'd achieved since immigrating to the country 15 years ago. As he turned onto Cedar Street, where his modest apartment complex stood just a few blocks away, something in his rearview mirror caught his attention. Red and blue lights suddenly illuminated the interior of his car, reflecting off his mirrors and temporarily blinding him. Raj's heart skipped a beat, but he remained calm, drawing on the same composure that served him well during hospital emergencies. Following protocol, he carefully signaled and pulled over to the right, making sure to stop under a streetlight for visibility. His mind raced through possibilities. Was he speeding? Did he miss a stop sign? He was certain he'd been driving carefully, as he always did in his prized possession. The moment he stopped, Raj did everything by the book. He turned off the engine, placed his hands at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel where they would be clearly visible, and took slow, measured breaths to stay relaxed. Through his side mirror, he could see an officer approaching, their hand hovering near their weapon, a detail that made his stomach tighten despite his conscious effort to remain calm. Years of working in the ER had taught Raj to read people's body language, and something about the officer's approaching stance told him this wasn't going to be a routine traffic stop. He could feel tension building in the air, thick and heavy like the atmosphere before a storm. What happened next would remain etched in his memory forever. The beam from the officer's flashlight swept across the car's interior before settling on his face. The light was harsh and direct, making it impossible for him to clearly see the officer's features. But he could hear the skepticism in their voice clearly enough. "Is this your car, sir?" The question came sharp and quick, laden with an unmistakable tone of suspicion that made Raj's professional composure waver for just a moment. In his rearview mirror, he noticed 2 more patrol cars pulling up, their lights painting the quiet residential street in alternating flashes of red and blue. The peaceful drive home had suddenly transformed into something else entirely, something that would not only change his life, but would eventually impact an entire police department's approach to community relations. As Raj sat there, hands steady on the wheel, he had no way of knowing that this moment would become a catalyst for change, sparking conversations and actions that would ripple through the community for months to come. In that moment, though, all he could focus on was maintaining his composure and remembering everything he knew about handling difficult situations. His years of experience dealing with high-pressure scenarios in the ER would prove invaluable in the next few minutes, as what started as a simple traffic stop was about to become much more complicated. The sound of car doors opening and closing behind him indicated that more officers were approaching. Raj took another deep breath, his mind already working through how to handle what was coming next. He knew that every word, every movement, and every decision he made in the next few minutes would be crucial.